Today we're working on a 1999 Toyota Corolla. It has 276,000 miles on it, and there is a leak where the exhaust manifold connects to the downpipe. Toyota made this car with a CO2 sensor right below one of the bolts that connects that downpipe up to the manifold. So what I'm showing you today is how to get the nuts off of these studs that hold that CO2 sensor on. And then once we get the CO2 sensor out, we will be able to get to the bolts from underneath and put some new ones in along with some new gaskets. And hopefully this will help your car run a little smoother and sound a little better. And my biggest worry was once it started leaking up around that manifold is I was worried about the heat being around the fuel lines, because there is a fuel line right back here. And so I was really worried about that because obviously gas and heat don't mix. So hopefully this video helps you out, and like it if it does. Thank you. I did want to give you a rundown of the tools that I used for this project. So on the right I had the pry bar and a screwdriver. Those were used to pry that CO2 sensor off, since one of the bolts from the exhaust manifold had dropped and it wouldn't just come out. Luckily I was fortunate enough to not screw up the threads too much in the studs for that O2 sensor. I have a 1/2 inch socket and a 1/2 inch wrench I used to put that on the clamp for the front of the catalytic converter where it connects to the back of the downpipe. As far as the 1/4 inch ratchet and the 13mm socket, I used that to put the new nuts on for the CO2 sensor, the ones I bought from the store earlier. And then I also have towards the left here with the 17mm socket on the 9-inch extension. The 9-inch extension is what you'll use to get up to the actual back of the manifold, and that's used to put the new bolts in. I have a 6-point 13mm socket, you can see, and that is, like I said earlier, about, you want to make sure you use a 6-point socket and not a 12-point socket for this project, because these heads of these bolts are pretty bad. Now, during this project, I bought this set, and it cost me $35 shipped to my house. It is a set of like grip tight sockets. Now that's not the name brand, but this socket set came with 13 sockets, and basically one of these nuts here that I was trying to get off of the O2 sensor would not come off. And I believe it's the top one. As you can see, it's all stripped out. And within about 1 or 2 minutes, the socket I picked out of here got it right off. So it was definitely worth the money. On the left is the pry bar, and it has a sharper edge on it, so I used it to clean the material off the gasket area where the CO2 sensor mounts. I wanted to show you how I got down into the CO2 sensor. I ended up having to come in from the top. I did disconnect these 2 cables here from this bracket, as you can see, just so they'd move around with my arm. I ended up sticking my right arm to the right of these things right in the center, and then I went down in here. And as you can see, if you look down in there, you will see the CO2 sensor that has brand new nuts on it, and you can see the new springs on the downpipe. So I, for a long time, did not believe I would ever get into this, but I did, and I was able to do it, and it was tough, and that's why I made this video. So I hope you look forward to what you're about to see. Obviously, at this point in time, the project is pretty much done, but I'm going to lead you through how I got to where I started. This is what it looks like once the oxygen sensor has been removed. As you can see, the bolt that we need to be able to take out to get to the exhaust gasket is directly above it. Once we can get that bolt out, hopefully this pipe will fall down out of the car to the point that we can get the new gasket on it and put a new bolt up in there. This clamp right here actually holds the downpipe to the catalytic, the front of the catalytic converter anyways. As you can see, I've had this clamp off. I did replace the bolt in there because it was pretty bad, but it did come off okay. And I did replace the gasket inside of there. That gasket I was able to find at the local auto parts store also. But when I remove this, I'll have to pull the downpipe out of the inside of the catalytic converter, and then hopefully that'll give us a little more play to pull the downpipe down away from the manifold and put our gasket up in there. Okay, just to give you an idea here, this right here is the gaskets and the bolts that I pulled out of it. Now we got to keep in mind that one of these bolts, this front one, I actually took out 2 years ago thinking it'd be an easy gasket replacement, and then I got up in there and found out that that CO2 sensor was there. And so I put back in this bolt right here in a new spring. If you look here at this bolt, once you get past a certain point, there are no threads. So, but I'll give it to this for Toyota. They did come out. And as you can see, the other one came out just a few minutes ago. This is the old gasket. And it doesn't look too bad on this side, but if you flip it around, it's blown out on this side. And that was probably due to this bolt right here that I couldn't get to tighten up anymore. Here is the new gasket, which is available at your local auto parts store, usually in stock. And then right here is what a brand new bolt would look like. It comes with the washer. It comes with the piece up on the inside, and that piece is to take the place of where this right here is in this bolt. So just so you know, this is a 13 millimeter. And this is a 17 millimeter. And the bolts don't look the same size, but that's because the one is wore down so bad on the left. One thing I will say is I did use the 13 millimeter 6-point socket. Now, in case you don't know, there is a difference between 6-point sockets and 12-point sockets. It's pretty simple. So I don't have one of that size right here available right now, but if you look inside this socket, you can see all the teeth that are in that socket. Well, when you use a 6-point socket, it's a lot more solid for each edge of the bolt. And so that's what I'd suggest trying to put on these bolts first. If not, we will discuss a kit that I bought. It's actually in the front of the video there where I showed you what tools I used. And that is what I would use past this if really needed be. On the right, we have the gasket that came off of the CO2 sensor. In the middle of the two nuts that came off of those bolts. I ended up having to use those sockets that I had showed you earlier to help get those nuts off of there. And so I went to the local auto parts store and I bought two lock nuts that are M8 by 1.25 millimeter. And they the bolts, sorry, the nuts that I had threaded onto the bolts at the hardware store just fine. So I hope these will work out fine. As you can see, the gasket on the right is a hair longer than the gasket on the left. I don't like to do this, but they are very hard to find. Toyota does sell them, but it would take about 3 or 4 days to get one in because they don't use them very often. And so I took the gasket on the left, and I did snip out to where I could get it around the bolts. And I'm going to see how it does. It may not last long, but now that I'm putting the new nuts on, I know I can get them back off. And since I have access through the top, it's not going to affect anything else I do here tonight. And we can go from there on that. All right, I want to come back and show you what it looks like after the pipe is back up in there. You can kind of see the shiny on this side. That is that washer. And then the one that I took out on that side, I put back in, of course, because it was the one that I put in a couple years ago. I did take it and put it on the bench grinder to the threads with the wire brush, just to kind of clean it off and make it easier to go back up in there. Both of them went up and bottomed out. Now, something I did want to mention, the gasket that goes up in there that I showed you earlier, make sure the cone side is down and the flat side is up towards the manifold. Inside of this downpipe, you will feel a cone shape. So you want to make sure that gasket goes down there and seats real well. I'm going to move on back here and we're going to look. I did get the clamp back on right here. And same thing with this. When you put the gasket on it, the cone side goes back towards the converter and the flat side goes towards the front. And now all I have to do is slide that rubber back on and I'll move up top to put the O2 sensor back in. The O2 sensor went back in just fine. As you've seen earlier, all the nuts went right back on the studs. The car sounds really good, and thank you so much for watching our video. Just remember, all it takes is your own ambition.